Episode 6 of the Helliepod. Getting it up a little bit late here on Monday, but better late than never. Mike Silver, tremendous reporter for NFL Network, going to join us in just a few minutes, talking primarily about Dennis Rodman and The Last Dance doc. Mike Silver, very close to Dennis Rodman, was actually on several of those epic benders, those trips to Vegas, wrote about them for Sports Illustrated, also wrote a book with Rodman as well. But first, I want to talk about sports being back. Man, how pumped are we? Even if you're not a UFC fan, you had to be elated for real live sports happening over the weekend. UFC 249 in Jacksonville was a tremendous step and a huge step in the right direction for fans in sports who are just thirsty for something to watch or somebody to root for. So cool to see Dana White saying today that several commissioners from other sports leagues have reached out to him to say, how did you pull this off? How did you get this done? And can you help us? Can you share that information with us? Which apparently he's going to do. He had a 30-page document that he sent to the leaders in Florida and Nevada, the governor and their staff, to say, this is how we're going to do it, and this is why it's going to be a success. And guess what? The worst possible thing happened. One fighter, Jacare Souza, two of his cornermen tested positive for the coronavirus the day before the fight. So on Friday, he tests positive for coronavirus. He's taken off the card, and guess what? They moved on. Everything was okay. That was it. They took that fight, they took it off the card, and they moved on. Now, it was interesting to watch the fights with no fans. 0 fans were in there. There were about 300 staff members, personnel from ESPN and the UFC. They were there all week long in Jacksonville, and they got tested multiple times throughout the week. So the UFC had access to about 1,200 tests. There were 300 people. They tested them multiple times throughout the week. And that was one of the reasons that Jacare Souza, they found out because they tested him again on Friday, got that positive test back, but it didn't affect anything else. And everything went off as planned. It was kind of funky. You know, the fighters walking in, some of them having air high fives to fans. Many of the fighters, including former NFL star Greg Hardy, said they could hear what the commentators were saying while they were in the octagon, and they adjusted accordingly. Hardy, for instance, said that he could hear Daniel Cormier, one of my old broadcast buddies from the Contender Series, saying that he needed to check the kicks better. And so he started doing that and eventually got the win. This reminded me actually a little bit of the Contender Series, because the Contender Series, they shoot now at what's called the UFC Apex, which is on the campus basically of the UFC facility in Las Vegas. It's a very small gym, and it has, I don't know, maybe 5-6 rows of bleachers, and it's just family, very close friends of the fighters who were there that night. Great new facility. It just went into action last year, and I believe they are going to try to have fights there in the very near future after they wrap things up in Jacksonville. But even with the fighters being able to hear what the announcers are saying, John Anik and Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier, they're not going to change that. Talk to the UFC today. They said they're going to keep them right there. It's a new era, and that's something that's just going to be a little different, very unique about this time period. But I applaud the UFC for getting this done, becoming the first major sporting event in months here in the States. And they're going to have fight nights on Wednesday and Saturday from Jacksonville because the infrastructure is already there and it is already in place. So we're going to be seeing more fights this week. Cannot wait for that. It was a great card too. By the way, that main event was just a war between Justin Gaethje and Tony Ferguson. Gosh, I like watching Gaethje fight. He is so good, so tough. You could see him in between rounds there. Just, all right, just getting so pumped up. He literally is having so much fun during the fight that he can't contain himself. And then you had Francis Ngannou, who's just a monster with a 20-second knockout, a controversial finish between two of the all-time greats in Henry Cejudo and Dominic Cruz, with Cejudo winning and retiring on the spot. So I believe the numbers were really, really good for that fight. I can't imagine that they wouldn't be, being the first sporting event in quite some time. And we're going to get a lot more UFC this week. They literally own the sports calendar right now. And hopefully they can reap the rewards, because we're going to be seeing some good fights this week. So sports is back. That's the UFC. And The Last Dance continued with episodes 7 and 8. So we're going to talk a little hoops now. It's the Helliepod, presented by Viore. And without much further ado, my good buddy Mike Silver from the NFL Network, formerly of Sports Illustrated and Yahoo, just moving on up. When I say Sports Illustrated, I mean the golden era of Sports Illustrated. Silver, you know what I'm talking about. When we couldn't wait to get the magazine in the mailbox as kids. I mean, that was when you wanted to be at Sports Illustrated, and you were doing cool things like partying with Rodman for days and then writing about it. So that's where I want to start. We'll talk football in a little bit, but that cover story you did on Rodman in the mid-90s when he was with the Spurs, with the parrot and the rhinestone collar and the shiny pants, like that was kind of the blossoming of your relationship with him, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a crazy slice in time. I had been hired at Sports Illustrated from the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat, which is a pretty unusual jump, in 1994, late 1994. I was 29 years old, and that next May, they called and said, hey, we want you and Rodman. Now, this was an interesting match because I had already shown them that I could kind of get access to people who were considered tough to reach, and that I like to go out late and do what it took. That's work ethic, Dan, as you know. And Rodman was just starting to get weird, or to show his weirdness, and was on the Spurs, getting ready to close out the Western Conference Finals against the Lakers. And they just said, hey, fly to LA. They play Thursday. Just fly to LA and see if you can hang with them. And I didn't know, if he'd told me to get lost or not. Went down to that shoot around on the Thursday, and we proceeded to go on a 4-day, 3-state bender, slept about 6 collective hours, went to Vegas, obviously hit it off really, really well. And I wrote this story. I'll show you since I'm in my home studio. The frame on the wall. There's the rare bird.
Yeah, there's the cover, the famous cover with Rodman right there. How do you balance when you're with somebody like that? How do you balance hanging out and then trying to remember, especially in the state that I'm sure you're in half the time, stuff for the story?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it was something that throughout my SI career, you kind of had to navigate, from slipping off to the bathroom and taking a few notes. And listen, we had fact checking and 7 layers of editing, and with time, you could go circle back and make sure with the subject, you are accurately representing them. But, in this case, there was a lot to remember, and there was a lot of alcohol. The first night, I remember we were at a club in West Hollywood, and listen, I was 29, he was 34, and Dan, you've been out with me. I was like, I could drink with any 34-year-old for one night when I'm 29.
Oh yeah.
No. Rodman likes these little girl drinks, Goldschlager and Jägermeister and Kamikazes. I was pouring shots out under the table that night, unbeknownst to him, because I was, there's no way. And I remember we were outside, and that's where he gave me some of the Madonna quotes, including, she has ways of making you feel like King Tut, which was not even the most sexually risque quote that he gave me that night. We had to fight to get a lot of this at SI at the time. And one of the quotes, I'm not sure if I got it into that story or a later story, but when he started talking about gay sex fantasies, he said, I'll tell you this, if I ever do decide to love another man, I'm going to find someone just like me and love the bleep out of him. it'd be like two bulls going at it, bro. I promise you that. Imagine trying to get that by the Ivy League educated SI
Oh yeah.
editors, tweed bow tie wearing SI editors in 1995. But I think what was going on is that he had been a guy who felt deep inside that he was a weirdo, that he was a freak, and was scared most of his life that if he let that out, it would be terrible and people would hate him and he'd be castigated and marginalized. And he finally started to let it out, and some of that happened, but he was just shocked that so many people in society, many of whom didn't care about basketball or even sports, how many people that resonated with and how many of them felt like he was important for doing that. And specifically the LGBTQ community, transgender people. He was talking about things that in that era were, just not talked about in the sports world, and sticking up for them and expressing a commonality with them. And I saw so many people time after time in person go up to him and hug him and tell him thank you, and talk to him about how important that was. And I know that gets lost a lot in the circus, which was as amazing as it looked, and the alcohol and the craziness of the party, that all happened and it was fun. But there was also something pretty cool going on in an era when the sports world was pretty boring and people weren't really living out loud.
How much of an impact did Madonna have on him in that sense? Because the feel I get from reading the book and reading your articles is that he still had a great amount of respect for Madonna.
Yeah, he did. And it had a lot to do with it. Now, a lot of people think that there's a direct traceability from Madonna to Rodman in that she was one of the most savvy marketers in the history of massive celebrity, right? She
Sure.
reinvented herself. She knew how to, freshen things up and shock. And I'm sure they had those conversations. And I know that some of what he did was with that in mind, but people kind of miss the point on that too. They think that Rodman, it was this grand marketing scheme. I was there for a lot of it. It was punch drunk breakfasts at 9 a.m. after we've been out all night. And people, oh, bro, what if I put on a wedding dress? It was more whimsical, and he wanted to push the conventions of society and make a point about how conventional and boring and restricted most people were, including Michael Jordan, by the way, who he respected so much as a teammate and leader, but thought was living his life the complete wrong way. And I'm sure, and I know that was mutual or vice versa. But, Dennis and I talked a lot about Jimi Hendrix and Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and some of the public theater that had happened in counterculture in the 60s and what that did and what that meant. And I know that resonated with him too. He wanted to make a statement to society that, all these boring, contrived people are doing it wrong, and that I'm onto you, and that you should, be willing to deconstruct it and poke fun of yourself a little bit because you're boring the crap out of me.
Now, there's nobody better in my mind to follow Dennis Rodman around than you, because there's a certain level of weirdness about Mike Silver and a tremendously high level of likability where you can just kind of be in a room with anybody and get along. And I think that's one of your great talents. But there has to be a moment or moments with Dennis Rodman that would even make you blush or shake your head or say, what the hell am I doing here?
Oh yeah, there are a lot. And listen, what's weird to me is, I was in the Rodman 30 for 30. I'm watching The Last Dance. I just can't believe how little footage exists of all of us going out, because we were not hiding. It was not subtle. It was loud. It was not shielded. There were no VIP rooms. Michael Jordan would go to Vegas and sit in a room alone with a dealer and nobody could see in. We were out at the craps tables of the Mirage, Dennis was hugging tourists and, just a man of the people. And we'd go out to Crowbar in Chicago, 1,000+ people there. We right in the middle of it, on the stage, in the crowd, no VIP area. And so it's just stunning to me. I guess I should be grateful in some sense that no footage exists, I guess, but I'm kind of curious. I'd like to see it. I'd like my kids to be able to check it out. And I can't believe that in the same lifetime, it's not like phones didn't exist, phone cameras didn't, but here it was 25 years ago, and apparently everything we did all the time was completely not chronicled. But now, if you go to the grocery store, somebody's got you on video, and here we are on video. So it's been a crazy transition. But really, my friendship with Dennis, to me, it's like I get kind of emotional about it, and it's really touching to me because I've described it before. It's kind of like your best friend when you're 10. There's nothing better. It's like you love that guy. Now, sometimes you have to have an emotionally developed conversation with that person. And when it's a 10-year-old best friend, it's kind of frustrating. And, one of those times was when our book, Walk on the Wild Side, came out. It was during the 97 playoffs, and he was having a rough year. That was the year he kicked the photographer, and he had been suspended, and he wasn't playing well. His knee was hurt, and he got frustrated. And when the book came out, Dennis was great about letting me, really take the narrative in extreme places with his voice, and he was cool with all of it. And he was being questioned one day by some Chicago reporters. I think they were in Atlanta for a playoff series. And they said, well, what about this thing? What about this? That doesn't even sound like you. And in what he believed was an inside joke, to me, said, oh, it's like he took my words like he was on acid and, rearranged them or something. And that was our inside joke. Because I went to Cal, and he would say, oh, Berkeley, you and smoking mushrooms and LSD. And, I think he just got frustrated and tried to mess with me, but it was taken as Dennis Rodman didn't really say the things in his own book, which, right, prompted a phone call from me, a few hours before a game. And I was really angry. And he was like, oh, come on, bro. He's like, I was just messing around. And I said, hey, aside from my personal feelings, from a marketing perspective, if you're trying to get people to believe that Walk on the Wild Side by Dennis Rodman is actually by Dennis Rodman, you might want to avoid statements like that. And at one point he said, oh, man, hey, you coming to the game? I'm like, no, I'm not coming to the game. I'm in California. Stop doing that. But, on the other hand, I mean, one of the most touching things that's happened to me in my career. So 1995, that story runs, and I remember saying to him before I left San Antonio, you realize that when this runs, it's going to change your life. You're going to be getting called fag and horrible slurs by people at games. It's not only just going to blow up in terms of shock value, but there's going to be a lot of hate coming your way. And are you prepared for that? And I know for a fact that when the story hit, and it was such a shock, that one person very close to him advised him, deny everything. Say you didn't say it. Blame it on the writer, and wow, that's your best play. And so now, a few days after the story, he is on David Letterman, which, as you know, in 1995 was as big as it gets. And David Letterman has the magazine in his hand, and he says, Dennis, I'm reading this crazy story about you. Did the writer just kind of go some places? And that's, oh, he's a great writer. That's a great story. I love it. I'm like, whoa. And then he said, Letterman held up the magazine and said, but does this accurately represent your thoughts? And he said, yeah, absolutely. I love that story. And I was like, wow. Because, we had just met, and I was, early in my SI career, and, to have someone stick up for me and tell the truth like that at a time where a lot of people were coming at him, that really, really touched me. And, I'm really proud of him for hanging in there. He's been through a lot. He's really struggled with alcohol and tried at various times to to get a grip on that, which is hard because it's one thing for someone like me to go up alcohol if I did, because I'd be like, man, I love having fun, I love drinking, but I'm pretty good at it, but I've had a good career. Dennis Rodman is a Hall of Fame drinker too. I mean, he's absolutely the life of the party. He's a freak of nature, and he creates complete environments that revolve around how fun he is when he's drinking. And so, but seriously, I am really proud of him for hanging tough and fighting through some stuff. And a lot of people thought all the money would be blown and that he'd be dead or in terrible circumstances by this point. And he's addressed that with me before and said, you know what, where I've came from, we always assume we blow the money anyway. It's all gravy, but I'm really proud of him for hanging in.
His relationship with Michael, you mentioned a little while ago, they had respect for each other. Did they like each other? They didn't hang out off the court, but did he like Michael?
They liked each other as basketball people. Dennis loved not only how great a player Michael was, but how much he cared and how much he led and how important it was to him and how hard he played on both ends, by the way, because for you youngsters, Michael Jordan was also by far the best defensive guard of his era. And Dennis is a guy who Michael loved basketball wise because long before he joined the Bulls, and probably a reason that Michael wanted him on the Bulls, and they had those battles when Dennis was in Detroit. But this is a guy who acted on the court like nothing was more important, extending horizontally for a ball, having a game where he scored no points and 28 rebounds, battling for boards against bigger guys, being willing to guard Akeem Olajuwon in the 1995 Western Conference Finals when his teammate and that season's regular season MVP, David Robinson, who like Akeem was a 7-footer, couldn't handle Akeem. And Dennis Rodman, who's probably 6'5" and a half, had to guard him. And so that guy who cared that much when he played, Michael knew the importance of that. And that was their connection because they were absolutely the opposite off the field, and neither one really thought the way the other guy was doing it, thought much of it. Dennis thought that Michael was repressing his real self and that it looked like no fun and that he needed to lighten up and just go with it and not worry about his image. And Michael thought Dennis was insane and living way too loose and not and imperiling the team with some of his behavior. But, they made it work for 3 unbelievable years.
That they did. I mean, it was really impressive. One of my other takeaways while the Last Dance has been going on is the reverence that Rodman holds for Scottie Pippen. Actually said if LeBron was playing in that era, Pippen would have been a better player. He just raves about what Pippen could do all over the court. And so I'll ask you the same question. I know how he feels about Scottie as a player, but as a friend, was there anybody else on that team besides Jack Haley, who was there for a minute with him, that he would hang out with?
Yeah, and it wasn't Scottie. I grew up with Steve Kerr, so I've known him for a long time.
Sure.
And I believe, at Rodman's Hall of Fame induction, I was there, and 2 former teammates were there. Any team, any level, any team, and that was Steve Kerr and Judd Bushler, who played with Steve at Arizona and with the Bulls, and they were part of our incredible celebration that night. And Rodman he hated hanging out with the wives. To him, that was one of the most establishment things ever. In fact, when we were in Vegas during that first meeting, for that story, the plan was to fly to Phoenix to watch Game 7 of the Rockets Suns in the other Western Conference semifinal, which was essentially scouting their next opponent, and we were going to show up courtside and freak everyone out. But Bob Hill, the coach of the Spurs at the time, who Rodman affectionately referred to as Boner, which is also in the story, and maybe not so affectionate, but Boner called and demanded that Dennis get back to San Antonio for an off-day function. And what we ended up doing it, but one of Dennis's big complaints and why he resisted for a long time was that he didn't want to hang out with the boring-ass wives. And when he got to Chicago, well, Steve and I grew up together, and we met our respective wives, Leslie and Margot, around the same time, and we both overachieved. And I knew Margot, and so when Dennis got to the Bulls and made a derogatory comment about the wives at one point, I said, "Hey, you might like a couple of these wives," and sure enough, once he went out with Steve and Margot and Judd and his then wife Lindsay, he was like, "Oh yeah, they're pretty fun." So he went out with Steve and Judd quite a bit, and I will say this: Rodman, he was a student of the game, and he was a student of all games, because he may or may not have loved friendly wagers on other sports. And he had some of the great insights I've seen in football. And we watched he was a big Cowboy fan because he was from Dallas. And
Sure.
we watched a game together where they were struggling in the playoffs. I think it was the game where Deion Sanders got knocked out cold on a reverse when he was playing on offense, a super scary concussion. And they were losing maybe to the Panthers. And he said something in the heat of the moment when he was upset that I thought, like, voiced something that I'd been thinking about for a while and that could never really put into words succinctly. And he said it was something to the effect of, "Troy Aikman, when things are going well, best quarterback I've ever seen. When things are going bad, worst player on the field." And obviously that was an exaggeration, but all the things I'd kind of thought, which is, do we penalize Troy for making it look so easy so much of the time? And his greatness it's not like Joe Montana bringing you back or Elway because things are lost. But a lot of times Troy's greatness is that the Cowboys just were so much better than you, and he was so perfect that it never got to that. But yet, does he really grit out a lot of games as much as you want him to? Dennis Rodman said that in one sentence, day drinking on a party bus. And I would kind of looked at him like, wow, I'm stealing that, dude.
It's deep without being deep. I love your impression, by the way, of Dennis Rodman. You have a great Steve Kerr story that we saw in the doc. I believe it was episode 7 that we're going to get to in 1 minute. First, we're going to take a quick break so I can tell you about Viore. It is a new perspective on performance apparel. If you're sick and tired of your old traditional workout gear, try Viore. This stuff is awesome. You can get 20% off. All you have to do is go to VioreClothing.com/Helliepod. That's VUORI clothing.com/Helliepod. They have men's shorts, men's sweatshirts, great workout t-shirts, joggers for both men and women. They have this new poncho pant that hopefully quarantine is over at some point in the near future. But when you're hanging around your house, Silver, I don't know if they sent this in the package to you, but it's the most comfortable pant I have ever worn on the entire planet. It's VioreClothing.com/Helliepod for 20% off. I promise you, try it out. You won't be sorry.
That's the first thing I'm going to do when I get off this podcast is try to find those pants and put them on. I'm pumped.
Damn right, Silver. I can't wait. I want to hear all about it. But not before I hear about this Steve Kerr story. Kurt tells the story last night in episode 7 or 8. I can't remember which one. But basically, when Michael came back from playing baseball, they were in practice. Michael was just riding the shit out of him. And he's like, I just snapped. I broke. And I know I was either going to crater or I had to stand up to him. And he did. And how does the story go when he's telling you? And is your head just spinning that this guy you grew up with just got in a fist fight with Michael Jordan in practice?
Yeah, although also when he hit the game-winning shot, to the championship-winning shot, also when he retired as the all-time three-point percentage leader in NBA history, which he still owns. And of course, I grew up a Warrior fan in LA, so I got teased by all my LA friends for being the Bay Area sports fan all my life, including Steve. So I played that well because ultimately he came my way.
Awesome.
And,
yeah.
But no, I had Steve and I wrote a sports column together for our high school newspaper which was the Palisades Tide Line. It was called the Rip Tide and lived down to its name. No, it was pretty good. And Steve's hilarious. So in 1997, Sports Illustrated sent me out to do a story on Steve. And so my wife, Leslie, and I and our newborn daughter, Natalie, flew out, and we stayed at Steve and Margot's house. And Nick and Maddie were little at the time, and, just hung out for a few days. So, we first get there, and Steve and I are catching up. And so I'm like, so dude, Michael Jordan and you like got to fight. And so he said it, he goes, dude, I think he was, not loving me when he came back for a variety of reasons, things he'd heard, stuff with the labor situation. I was the player rep, and I could just tell it wasn't good, and it's getting worse and worse. And I'm finally at a point where I'm like, okay, I either am going to back down and be considered a wuss in this building forever, and I can never fight my way out of that, or I'm going to fight Michael Jordan. Great choice, and I'm like, what'd you do? And it's like, I fought Michael Jordan and got my ass kicked.
But of course he did.
Yeah, of course he did. So, it's surreal. The other guy that I knew in the NBA, who I went to college with, was Kevin Johnson and at Cal. And he idolized Magic Johnson, like many of us did, thought it was the greatest player he'd ever seen. And then Kevin Johnson got in a fight with Magic Johnson. So I'm like, okay, so one of my friends fought Michael, the other one fought Magic. Glad I didn't make the NBA.
Yeah, who are you fighting? You fighting somebody on press row, Silver?
Yeah, I'm not, well, maybe, but I'm not a good enough fighter or basketball player. But so Steve, I'm so proud of him too. And not just, I can't believe that a guy that I guarded at times, played 15 years in the NBA, won 5 championships, and, has coached 3. But I just, he's someone who's like was the best dude in the world growing up and has become better. And, just him as a person and a
well, and he's one of those guys, Silver. He's smart. He's progressive. Like Popovich, you can ask him about worldly things and get a worldly answer from him, which is not the case with all NBA coaches or NFL coaches or anybody, for that matter. And that's one of the things that I think I really appreciate about Steve Kerr. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I promised I would get you off by a certain time, and I will do that. So I want to ask you one NFL question.
That's what she said, Dan. That's what she said.
You're the man, which because that is your job right now. Okay, the most interesting player-related storyline, because obviously the most interesting storyline is how much or how little of this season are we going to have because of coronavirus. But the most interesting player-related storyline in the offseason, right? You can have Brady or Prescott or Cam Newton not with the team yet, or Aaron Rodgers and them drafting a quarterback in Green Bay. What's the one or two storylines that have stood out the most to you in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I thought when the Packers drafted Jordan Love, that was a big, big deal. I had virtual access into Jaguars general manager Dave Caldwell's draft room, which was awesome. But believe it or not, his wife, Joelle, held up the phone via the House Party app for pretty much the whole first round. And I got to see it. And so she's the real MVP. But so I was writing late that night. But because I went to Cal, and because when my sons were very young, they were Cal fans, of course. My wife and I went there. And when Aaron Rodgers got drafted by the Packers, they just decided they were Packer fans. So I have a household full of Packer fans. And as the Packers drafted Jordan Love, I had taken a break to eat a little dinner with the family. And my sons and my wife were not happy. They were aghast. And not just because, it's a threat to Aaron Rodgers, but we could have used that pick for a receiver or Patrick Queen, or, that was a big, and Leslie, my wife, actually screamed at me, and I'm on deadline. I'm just grabbing some food. Actually screamed at me, call Matt LaFleur right now, because she knows I'm, pretty close to Matt LaFleur. I talked to him earlier in the day. And so I did call Matt LaFleur. We talked the next morning, and I wrote about it on NFL.com. And, listen, I have not talked to Aaron. I've tried to. I think he is, he understands the optics. He knows that people will be looking at him. I think as long as Jordan Love doesn't come in acting entitled or, disrespectful, which from what I've heard is very, very unlikely given how the kid is, I think those two will be fine. And I don't think Aaron has a very strong sense of self, and I think he rightfully will not feel threatened like, oh no, this guy's going to be better than me anytime soon. Right. But I do think the opportunity cost, as I alluded, is frustrating. And if you're Aaron and you realize, wow, that's the first time they've drafted a skill player since me in 15 years in the first round, and it was a quarterback. That's kind of astounding. So, I think it'll be fine. And I think, honestly, if you're the Packers, the best way to play this, and I think it's reflective of reality, is that was a management pick. That was the general manager, Brian Gutekunst, and Mark Murphy, who runs that organization, looking to the future. But it's really the coaches and Aaron against the world now. And obviously Matt LaFleur is excited to coach Jordan Love, and that could end up being a great, great thing. But right now, I think if you're Aaron and you're the coaches, you're like, hey, look, we're not questioning who our quarterback is in any way, and we're thrilled to have you in year 2 of this offense. Let's go show everybody. And so that's the best way it could work short term. And if all goes well for the Packers, they've got a brutal decision in 2 or 3 years to make, and the decision is, you know what, we spent a first round pick on this guy, but Aaron's still good, and let's go get another heir apparent and keep rolling.
Yeah, I'm sure they hope they have a similar situation to what happened in New England with Jimmy Garoppolo. But that was a surprise to me. I've talked about it before. The championship windows are so small in the NFL that when you're coming off a 12, 13 win season and you have the opportunity to add pieces that can help you win now, I just feel like you have to do that. And I know Matt as well, and I know he said all the politically correct things, but I'm sure deep down inside he wouldn't have minded getting a receiver or an offensive lineman or somebody that can get to the passer on defense. But that's neither here nor there. And that's the end of the – go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll leave you with this too. It is – what people watching The Last Dance, they say, oh my God, imagine if that happened now. Could never happen with Twitter. First of all, it would have been more conspicuous in real time with social media, but Rodman wouldn't have changed a thing. Trust me. He would have lived exactly as outrageously now as then. And I just want to just sign off with this. I think people, because things blow up and become big and seem shocking, believe somehow that, things have never happened before on that level. And listen, I covered Favre and Rodgers. That was messy and weird at the end, and that was tough. But I covered Joe Montana and Steve Young breaking into the business, and they were teammates for 6 years. There were games where they alternated starts at times. There was a game I covered in 1988 when I was stringing for the San Francisco Chronicle just out of college at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. Steve Young played the first half against the Giants. Joe Montana played the second half, and Phil Simms led the Giants to a late touchdown, and they were going to win. And Montana at the end just threw one of those scarily accurate sideline passes to Jerry Rice that was like an optical illusion. And it was such a good pass that the safety and the corner collided. Oh. Rice caught it and went 78 yards down the sidelines, and the 49ers celebrated. And you know what that meant? Joe got to start the next week. And so, and by the way, those guys didn't get along at all. There's so many things happen. So I just don't want people, oh my God, Jordan Love and Aaron Rodgers are going to be on the same team. It's impossible. No, it's possible. I've seen worse. Trust me, my threshold is pretty high.
Well, we are prisoners of the moment, and I feel like so many people, I'm glad you brought that up, have forgotten about that, because even to this day, you talk to Joe, and there is no love lost there for his relationship with Steve Young, as you know well, being in the Bay Area right now. Mike Silver, one of the best in the business. I really appreciate the time, my friend, and hopefully we'll get to catch up soon.
Love it, Dan. Appreciate you.